I'm not sure if you can hear us. Can you hear me?
Can you hear me?
Your camera is frozen and we couldn't hear you. We can hear you now. Maybe.
Yeah, I'll continue. I'm load shed, so I'll be very quick.
Yes.
Just got load shed as I was speaking. So I'd like to really welcome all of you to this event on pharmaceutical manufacturing in Africa. The main purpose for holding this event really is to explore pathways for collaboration amongst African countries in creating, essentially in manufacturing drugs in the African continent, instead of relying heavily on outsiders, even though international partnerships are important. In this event, we working in partnership with the NIPRD in Nigeria, the National School of Governance in South Africa, and NXN Analytics. I will hand over to the Deputy Vice Chancellor, Lynn Morris, who is an internationally recognized scientist who's done a lot of work on the response, on the antibodies responses to HIV. She's an A-rated scientist and Deputy Vice Chancellor at the University of Witwatersrand. Over to you, Prof. Morris.
Thank you, Mzu. If I may come in, Prof. Morris, with apologies. I think just before you come in, because we'd like you to come in and to do the introduction of the minister as well, I'll request Dr. Obi Adigwe, who's one of our partners in organizing the event, the Director General of the NIPRD, just to give us a snapshot of the meeting purpose. And from there, then I'll call on you, Professor Morris, to please come in with your indulgence. Thank you.
Thank you, Nomfundo. And ladies and gentlemen, excellencies, good afternoon. Most of us on this particular conference today are Africans or friends of Africa. And as such, we're quite aware of the healthcare issues that plague us, from infectious diseases to non-communicable diseases, which the data suggests that in most parts of Africa, we've got prevalence in double digits. And we also know that apart from a handful of countries on the continent, most countries depend wholly on importation, and it's been like that for decades. And this isn't the first time people have come around to begin to speak about solving Africa's healthcare issues by developing pharma manufacturing capacity. The PMPA, of which we have one of the authors here today, has been on for decades, and we were privileged to help conceptualize the medicine security concept. But for a long while now, to be honest, if we must be honest with ourselves, we've been stuck at the talking stage. And COVID has yet again woken us up to demonstrate that we now need to move from talking the talk to walking the walk. And what we're doing here today is beginning that particular process of walking the walk. But we've very, very cleverly tried to use a slightly different approach from what other people have done in the past. Those of you who have received the program of events would notice that very, very cleverly, what we've done is assembled presentations and discussants from across Africa so that we can capture a Pan-African flavor to this discussion. We've also had a really good mix of hardcore pharmacy experts, as well as certain people who can bring fresh eyes, to the pharmacy manufacturing discussion. You would also recognize that we've put together the academia, people from the industry, practitioners, policymakers, and politicians in the same call. And all this has been in a very innovative approach to ensure that when we begin to come up with the road map going forward, people who will be able to implement it are also seated here in the room. And so, ladies and gentlemen, with that very short introduction as regards why we're here today, let me assure you that there will be very, very few meetings which you will sit in within this particular period, which will be more important than what you're going to be doing here today. Ladies and gentlemen, excellencies, let us now take a first step towards ensuring the future for not just ourselves, but all our children in Africa. Thank you, Nomfundo. You have the floor.
Thank you very much, Obi. And I think what's important to underscore really in what you've said is there are many discussions, and obviously COVID has triggered a lot of discussions on the need to beef up Africa's manufacturing capacity. But really the focus of today is to identify practical steps towards effective Pan-African collaboration so that this begins to become a reality. So we really look forward to the presentations and some of the practical suggestions that will come through. And with that, Prof. Morris, thank you for waiting just a little while.
No problem.
I'm going to ask you to come in now. Thank you.
Great, thank you so much. So I would like to, on behalf of the University of the Witwatersrand, really welcome all of you to this very important event. And I'd especially like to welcome the Honourable Minister of State for Health from Nigeria, who will be addressing us, giving us the keynote. And I think that really speaks to the importance of this event that the Minister will be addressing us. So I'd really like to acknowledge the significance of his participation. And as the previous speaker mentioned, the issue of pharmaceutical manufacturing is critically important and urgent for the African continent. And countries like Nigeria and South Africa can play a pivotal role in promoting greater inter-African cooperation on strengthening the health infrastructure and supporting through both bilateral and multilateral processes with key institutions such as the Africa Centre for Disease Control, the African Union CDC Partnership for Vaccine Manufacturing, and of course the newly established African Medicines Agency, or AMA. And so I think this conversation today will really help us generate more insights into how we can improve the African pharmaceutical manufacturing landscape. Because every time the African continent is faced with a major health crisis, we are reminded of our weaknesses, and that's at institutional level, country level, and even continental level, and our lack of preparedness to respond with agility in curbing the spread of infections. And of course, during COVID, we witnessed how the continent struggled to pull together the capacity for testing and contact tracing, and how its healthcare system was overwhelmed every time infections rose. And of course, we've seen how we've got left behind in the vaccine race. I just want to add a personal note. At the time that COVID first hit 2 years ago now, I was actually the director at the NICD, which is our National Public Health Institute. And just, the struggle that we had to get primers to run PCR tests. And that was our experience of all of our African colleagues. We didn't even have the capacity to make our own diagnostic kits. And so really this is long overdue. And so I'm really delighted, that you're having this engagement, because it is abundantly clear we need to build a robust infrastructure in the continent for Africa's long-term resilience. And building pharmaceutical manufacturing capabilities will require that we pay close attention to sound governance frameworks, fiscal resilience, technical capability, strengthening regional integration and cooperation, and develop human capital. And it's very important that African countries work together and share their experiences. And there's much optimism, as we will hear, that's been generated by the signing of the treaty for the establishment of the African Medicines Agency in November last year, which is aimed at harmonizing these harmonizing regulations, across the continent. I do note that South Africa is yet to sign that, and perhaps that'll be something that will be discussed. And so, although African countries do need to work closely with partners in the North and from other developing countries and emerging economies, The continent should coordinate its activities and take a long-term strategic view on building vaccine manufacturing capacity through scientific cooperation, technology transfer, developing human capital, and nurturing value chains. And I am very pleased to note that there has already been quite a few initiatives, and just, from South Africa, there's certainly been a number of initiatives to stimulate vaccine manufacturing, and that includes both public and private activities. And so we are already seeing, that encouraging sign. So I hope that the deliberations today will generate the kinds of insights that are required to move the continent in the right direction, improve collaboration, and build its own capabilities for pharmaceutical manufacturing. And I also specifically want to thank the Wits School of Governance, the National Institute for Pharmaceutical Research and Development of Nigeria, NIPRD, the consulting firm NXN Analytics, and the National School of Government of South Africa, who have actually pulled this together and organized this very important event. So now it really remains for me to introduce our keynote speaker. And as I said, I think we're very honored to have someone of this standing address us. And so Dr. Alekeki Olurumbi Mamora is a medical practitioner by profession and a politician by vocation. He was a students' union leader at the University of Ife, which is now Obafemi Awolowo University, where he graduated in 1981. Following his training, he set up his own private medical practice in 1987, and he then worked as the company medical officer at Cadbury in Nigeria, and he remained active in private medical practice until 1999, when he was elected into the Lagos State House of Assembly and was subsequently elected Speaker at the inauguration of the House in June 1999. He was elected Chairman, Conference of Speakers of Nigeria's State Houses of Assembly in 2001, and had a very robust participation in the Commonwealth Parliamentary Association during his 4-year tenure as Speaker. Dr. Mamora was elected into the Senate in 2003, and he was re-elected into the Senate for a second term in 2007. And while in the Senate, he served in various capacities, including the Senate Deputy Minority Leader, Chairman of the Senate Committee on Ethics, Code of Conduct and Public Petitions, and membership of the ECOWAS Parliament. Minister Mamora was the Deputy General of the APC Presidential Campaign Council in 2005, a position he also held in the 2019 presidential election campaign. He was appointing Managing Director or Chief Executive Officer of the National Inland Waterways Authority in 2011. And as I mentioned, he is currently the Honorable Minister of State for Health in the Federal Republic of Nigeria. So Senator Mamora has won many awards, decorations, and recognitions, both locally and internationally. He also, I'm sure he's a very busy man, but he manages to spend time with his many children and grandchildren and has a number of hobbies, which include reading, singing, traveling, football, and chess. So a well-rounded person, and I would like to invite him now to give us his address. Thank you.
Your Excellencies, distinguished ladies and gentlemen, I am highly delighted to be here at this webinar with the theme, Developing Africa's Pharma Manufacturing Capacity, Activating Effective Pan-African Collaboration, organized by the National Institute for Pharmaceutical Research and Development, NIPRD, in collaboration with National School of Government of South Africa, NSG, Wits School of Governance, WSG, and NXN Analytics. The importance of this program cannot be overemphasized, especially in this critical time when the world is battling with the COVID-19 pandemic. Furthermore, the fact that Africa has been discriminated against in terms of access to interventions across Africa have agreed to participate in this event. Alongside the robust engagement with the hundreds of participants registered for the event, I have no doubt that the outcome of this meeting will provide new impetus to strengthening Africa pharma manufacturing capacity towards the assurance of medicine security across the region. As we are all aware, COVID-19 pandemic has challenged the world, including the developed countries. The pandemic resulted in disruption of several activities such as access to healthcare, food, social amenities, and other essential and non-essential commodities. At the onset of the pandemic, the world could not provide any vaccines for prevention or medicines for treatment. Nations essentially had to rely on several non-pharmaceutical measures, such as frequent hand washing, physical distancing, use of hand sanitizer, and such other measures in order to reduce the spread of the disease. Not long into the pandemic, the National Institute for Pharmaceutical Research and Development, NIPRD, developed 3 products, and 2 of these products showed great potentials against COVID-19. These products have been listed by the Nigerian National Agency for Food and Drug Administration and Control, NAFDAC, and are currently at the clinical trial stage. I am equally sure that several other institutes present at this conference have also made equally innovative interventions for COVID-19 and for other critical issues that plague us on the continent. However, more can still be done in re-engineering the pharma sector to address continental health and socio-economic challenges. In many parts of Africa, high mortality and morbidity rates are evidence of the poor health indices that characterize healthcare in the region. Apart from the considerable burden of infectious diseases, there is also a significant and rapidly increasing prevalence of various relevant non-communicable diseases. This scenario is even further compounded by the high fertility rate across the continent, combined with the deplorable fact that most African countries still import 70 to 90% of their medicines. What this implies, however, is that there is a significant potential for growth in the medicines and commodities market. With the ongoing paradigm shift that favors local content development within Africa, especially after COVID-19, an opportunity exists within Africa for the emergence of a pharmaceutical manufacturing sector that can capture a significant proportion of the global market, whilst also benefiting from the health access gains and socioeconomic advantages. Currently, the African pharma sector, which is estimated at close to between 30 and 40 billion United States dollars, represents an abysmally low proportion of the 1.3 trillion global market. With the proper policies and interventions, the pharma sector in Africa will not only significantly improve access to health in the continent, it will also increase other socioeconomic indices. This is especially because the sector is associated with some of the highest value addition chains in terms of backward integration and ancillary sector development, policies in the sector can be re-engineered to enable rapid employment generation. Other socioeconomic benefits that will be enhanced in association with pharma sector development include foreign direct investment, knowledge transfer, capacity building, and backward integration in ancillary industries. Around this time last year, I was privileged to give the ministerial address at another NIPRD initiated international webinar that explored strategies to engage intellectual property issues for new COVID-19 technologies. Following that conference, high-level international Pan-African advocacy commenced. And I am glad to announce that an mRNA vaccine tech transfer program has now been initiated by the World Health Organization for Nigeria, South Africa, Kenya, Senegal, and Tunisia. With your engagement today, an independent, intellectual Pan-African platform can emerge, which will further support existing and emergent continental solutions. In this regard, I urge you all to be sufficiently Afrocentric, intrepid, and purposeful in your interventions. Distinguished and gentlemen, let me conclude by commending NIPRD, the National School of Government of South Africa, the Wits School of Governance, NXN Analytics, and its other partners and collaborators across Africa for conceptualizing and organizing this colloquium. This is precisely the sort of Afrocentric collaboration that will sustain the ongoing impetus in pharma sector development and ultimately result in the achievement of medicine security for all of Africa. Ladies and gentlemen, I thank you for your kind attention.
Excellency, thank you very much to you for this address and the colleagues from the ministry and the government in the Republic of Nigeria who made it possible for you to participate in this session this afternoon. I suppose one of the advantages of the pandemic is that we can have interactions like these ones across continents, across countries, across time zones, without having to fly and gather and meet somewhere to be able to share perspectives as we are doing today. And of course, as researchers, as teachers, as a government officials, and as an experts, there will no substitute for intimate interactions that need to take place between us to exchange ideas as we seek to find solutions to challenges facing societies today. I'm going to request my colleagues, starting with my colleague, Prof. Alex van der Heever, to do a presentation. We'll give them 10 minutes each with Dr. Augusto Munyai, followed by Ms. Dako in Senegal, in Ghana. I'll give you 10 minutes each. I will not interfere. So as soon as you have finished, Prof, we'll move on to the next, presentation, so that there is more time later on in the program for an engagement. So over to you, Prof. van der Heever.
Thank you, and good evening to everybody. It's a real pleasure to participate in this event today. What I'm going to be talking on is the topic is harnessing contextual links between African public health and pharma interventions. And I'm just going to share my screen. Hopefully you can see this. So I think that there are quite a lot of things to think about in looking at essentially making Africa and the region more resilient to the kinds of challenges that we've faced in the past few years. But it might have been accentuated by COVID, but we've actually faced these difficulties for a lot of conditions in the region. And so before going into the sort of the detail, I think there are a number of problems that exist. One is that the kinds of where innovation in pharmacy exists today is not necessarily prioritized toward the needs of Africa. And so if we do not have key interventions in the value chain for the production of pharmaceuticals, medicines, we're essentially losing out both on the development, the design of the treatments that we require in the region. But we also leave ourselves exposed to not having access to the developed medicines that have been developed that do affect us as well as industrialized countries. So there's a couple of things that we need to think about when it comes to the localization of pharmaceutical production, and I don't think it's a very straightforward issue. There's a standard economic view that you identify which part of the value chain you want to specialize in and grow it to scale. So that's how you might look at an industrial policy conventionally. So you might not invest in every single part of a value chain for, let's say, the production of the design and production of desktop computers. You might focus on chip production. You might focus on software development, but you might not focus on developing the Apple or any variant thereof. So the question is really, what do you, so that standard view suggests that you should specialize and that there are economic benefits to specialization. The economic benefit to specialization is scale. Is that if you try and do everything, not everything can be done to scale, and not every part of a country can't produce every part of the value chain of any particular product or any particular sophisticated product in a sustainable manner, because there will be competition somewhere else in the world that will outproduce you, that will be at a much lower cost for that part of the value chain where they are best positioned. So that's a sort of a standard view, and it definitely impacts on the viability of any enterprise that one looks at where you're dealing with production, manufacturing of anything. So this view has proven problematic when we look at the issue of medicines, because global pandemics, as we've seen, result in hoarding, they result in strategic health, social and economic risks. And those strategic health, social and economic risks outweigh the problems posed by inefficiencies resulting from the lack of scale of production. So when you want to think about this problem and you want to localize some aspect of production in any area, but in this one in particular, you need to localize from a strategic perspective, which means that you have to mitigate any resulting inefficiencies if the objectives merit it. So what one's really saying is that there are certain things where, in fact, you want to produce the product inefficiently, so to speak, because it is strategically in the interests of the region or the country to do so. And there's sort of two key issues that arise from that. One is that you want to prioritize potentially the innovation for the unique context of Africa. That's not happening necessarily. So COVID was prioritized because it was a global pandemic and because it impacted on all the countries where current manufacturing and innovation for medicines is concentrated in the industrial northern countries. So if one wants to localize, then you want to look at all aspects of the value chain and to make them work. That includes innovation as well. So now if one looks at the objectives that one wants to achieve, the problem that gets created is that you've essentially got to mix two particular strategic objectives that in many instances will involve different parts of government in developing a strategy. One is achieving public health resilience. And what you want to do there is ensure that there's guaranteed availability of essential medicines and vaccines. So that's an objective. The other objective is that if you want to achieve that, then you've got to have some sort of sustainable business model that ensures that the industrial model that you've built, which involves industrial policy to a large extent, ensures the long-term viability of an industry. So it's not one in which you throw some subsidy at it now and the subsidy starts to fall away. I mean, at the moment the subsidy goes away, the industrial policy fails.
Prof,
sorry.
Oh, okay. Sorry, thank you. Please go ahead, Busan. Sorry.
Your slide, Prof, is not moving. I don't know if you are moving it or you still should start. If you can put it on presentation mode and move it, we're still seeing your first slide, your opening one.
Only the opening one. Oh, okay.
Yeah. Harnessing contextual links. Yeah, sorry.
Oh, goodness. Okay. Is it moving now at all?
No.
No. Okay. I wonder. So you're not seeing. Okay. I don't know what that is because I've got.
Maybe remove it and reload and see what will happen.
Okay. I'll
remove and then share. Yeah.
Okay.
And put it on view mode.
Okay. Busan, perhaps slideshow mode will work better.
Yep.
It was on slideshow. Just it's not critical that I show it. So what I don't want to delay things, so I can talk to it. It helps me as a prompt. So let me rather just continue. It's not mission critical for the pictures.
Go ahead. You can share it here on the chat. Yeah, thank you.
Okay. Okay. So of the objectives, there are two particular strategic objectives. The one is public health resilience. The other is to have a sustainable business model, which has to be which essentially has to be established through an industrial policy of some form, an industrial policy framework that is implemented. And this is particularly necessary where there are parts of the production process that are not actually going to be completely efficient without some kind of framework that's in place that government has established. So if you had to look at the value chain, and I'd break it up into just very four basic components for the purpose of discussion. The first is innovation. At the level of innovation, essentially you want to look at two particular aspects from a strategic policy perspective. The one is domestic R&D, being able to innovate on one's own. And that means that there is an investment in capability to do this kind of research and development. The other involves the overall intellectual property framework and whether or not that is conducive to developing localized innovation as well. So, basically being able to fairly access innovation that has occurred elsewhere. And in many cases, this has been a very problematic feature of access to pharmaceuticals internationally, where essentially monopoly markets are developed through using the rules that are supposed to generate innovation. But in fact, what they are rules that create artificial monopolies. And we need to basically have a coherent IP framework as well. So we should be able to develop our own, but also be able to fairly access intellectual property from elsewhere. And the question is whether our intellectual property framework is adequate at this point, whether we're just accepting the rules from elsewhere. The second feature of the chain that becomes important because it imposes quite significant costs on any system is regulatory approval. So regulatory approval involves clinical trials, the proof of efficacy and safety, and the subsequent licensing, which can be regional and domestically regional and global, to access global markets. But obviously you're licensing in particular domains, even if you're going global. Now, within the region, the question is whether we've got an efficient licensing framework for anything that we're developing locally, or whether or not we're licensing separately in every single country in Africa, which can become an obstacle. So there is an issue of regional collaboration on the regulatory approval process for medicines and the clinical trials. South Africa itself has been very successful in developing capabilities for clinical trials. And they can be very costly. So the issue of where the money comes from for the clinical trials, if we do not have sufficient if we don't have scale in the companies domestically to fund them, raises the questions of how that framework operates. A lot of countries subsidize the clinical trials. That doesn't end up in the final price reductions associated with the relevant medicines, because the countries that subsidize heavily, so for instance, the United States and various other countries in Europe, might subsidize the production, but in fact, what they're really doing is it's a form of export subsidy for them. They're stimulating those businesses, and they're deliberately doing it because it helps their balance of trade numbers at the end of the day. So it's a form of export subsidy. And therefore it's not a subsidy in the traditional sense. It's a way of building up achieving a particular industry objective, which is sometimes very prejudicial to developing countries. Then on the next part of the value chain is production itself. And for production to be efficient, you need to have scale economies. And this is a problem in the region, is that if a country goes it alone in developing production capability, then the question is whether the market it's got is going to be big enough to sustain the investment in production capability. And if the unit costs are too high, it really does raise questions about viability down the line. So there is an issue about how you structure, how you achieve scale, how you get there. And that leads to the sort of the fourth part of the overall value chain, which is important, which is the market itself and demand. You've got a national market, you've got regional markets, you've got global markets. And the question really is, how do you maximize the size of the market that can be achieved for a region, which does suggest cooperative arrangements between countries on offtake from the domestic regional production. But the question of access to global markets can be, if you're generating a production capability for generalized export in the global market, it's going to raise issues around who your private partners are, because some private partners are already global players, and you will be trying to create production capability that will compete against their own production facilities elsewhere in the world, and they may not be willing to cooperate, but they will be prepared to cooperate on making you subsidize offtake in your country or in your region, but they're not prepared to support the generation of production capability that will compete against their global markets. So one has to think very carefully about how one organizes the players within this and what the public-private arrangements are. It also suggests that there does need to be regional cooperation on access to markets, particularly the public sector markets within the region, because that might generate the kind of scale needed for a production facility to be viable if it is not able to go global, but it should be able to sell within the region, and that will be protecting the sustainability of any pharmaceutical production process. If we then had to look at the role of government, and I'll sort of conclude on this, is that the role of government is very important in this, potentially, because this type of framework doesn't happen naturally on its own. You can leave it to, if you leave this market unregulated, I mean, without any kind of intervention and without any kind of public health and coordinated industrial strategy, it'll pretty much look like the market we've got at the moment, where we're essentially the subservient to the active strategies of many other countries. So the first issue of government is that it does have to clarify the strategic public value objectives that it is looking at. So and here the issue is the public health policy and the industrial policy. And the question is how the two sets of objectives are harmonized into a single strategic set of goals. And the question is, how do you sort of translate those, how do you basically get coordinated action on the part of government and actors within the society to basically put those together? Now, currently, government is very siloed in industrial policy and health policy. And so that's in the South African context, and I'm pretty sure it's replicated in many other countries. But essentially, the two areas do need to come together, because what you want to do is to say, what kind of demand do we want to generate? What kind of innovation? Where do we want to focus in innovation, for instance? Stuff that will be developed locally, innovated locally. And how do we support the full value chain to production? That becomes both a public health objective as well as an industrial policy objective if you need in any way to regulate or to subsidize aspects of that framework, either temporarily or on some ongoing basis. You also need to clarify the strategic value proposition for the private actor participation. I mean, why would they be involved? So you have to identify whether or not there are conflicts of interest that also need to be managed in the private actors, and making sure that their incentives are harmonized as part of the overall industrial and public health strategies. You want to find and be able to develop actors that are interested in the local regional market rather than their global interests. So it does mean you have to look very carefully at who you're partnering with. You have to identify areas also where government may be required to improve the sustainability of any strategy. So as I pointed out, you might have legal, regional or local offtake agreements that requires international cooperation. There's an issue about potentially accessing private markets, which are not controlled by government, and to look at how you would be able to harness those as well. You've got to look at the intellectual property regimes and stimulate and appropriately reward local innovation. You need to address the challenge of also the unfair IP practices. You have to look at licensing approaches, regional rather than local. You have to create viable PPP arrangements, potentially, public-private partnerships that make sense within the region, and they must also be properly governed. You also need viability subsidies, which might be preferably one-off where required, but a viability subsidy might be where government basically intervenes to make sure that a whole strategic objective is possible by leveraging it into existence. It might not require a permanent subsidy, but you need to identify where government basically needs to play that role. So at the end of the day, this is a relatively complex strategic set of objectives that requires a lot of actors to come together, including state actors. And the government responses, as I pointed out, are constrained by the silos within which policy is made and implemented. And so to create this combined strategy, one has to think very carefully about how government is organized in relation to these strategies, rather than ending up with a hodgepodge of interventions that don't really result in sort of a comprehensive framework. So I'll leave it there. That's a kind of a general overview of the kind of prerequisites potentially for getting this kind of strategy to localize in a sustainable manner.
Yeah, thanks, Prof, for that intervention. I just want to pick on one thing that you mentioned about the role of government. It's very significant, and that is why through efforts like these ones, we make sure that those who are responsible for making public policy are part of the conversation. To the extent that someone has got the power and authority to make public policy, either as an elected official or as an appointed official, and they do not have the sufficient amount of technical information required to enable quality decisions, many countries will miss the boat, will meet the boat as it were. So your intervention and what the Honorable Minister said earlier on is very critical, because we have to close the loop by ensuring that we empower sufficiently those who must make policy decisions. Let's move on now. Dr. Agostino Manyai, are you there? The colleague who is in Juba in the South Sudan. There are challenges. I mean, I think there's something common happening now elsewhere other than here in South Africa. There is challenges of energy shortages as it stands now. So I'm not sure if he is here. I see him is in a meeting. Let's see if he's able to.
Yes, I have just returned, and I can't guarantee what happens next. So okay. We're having a product network and also the energy issues here. But I can go, hopefully it will allow me to at least provide highlights within 9 minutes before it goes off again, but it's on and off.
Please,
so I'm not
please
sure.
Go ahead. Please go ahead.
I'm going to share my screen, if that's okay.
Yes, you can.
And then we'll provide some, I'll be quick, so then you guys don't lose me again.
Yes, we can see your screen. You can put it on slide mode, but we can see it.
Okay, I can put it on slide mode. So let me see. Start.
Or presenter view, or yeah. But yeah, you can go ahead so long whilst you maneuver it, please.
Yeah, it's still loading. No, thank you so much. And I apologize for this product network, which has caused interruption on my part. I missed some of the presentations made earlier by distinguished professors and colleagues from government. My job today is to, as opposed to really talking about an industrial framework, I think instead I will be motivating why this is important to have and to invest in. And so I have 9 slides that I thought would be useful in furthering this discussion. And the 9 slides begin with the motivation itself. And this motivation centers around understanding why it's important for us to begin investing in pharma manufacturing industry as Africans. And number one, it's to highlight the fact that imports, in this case, drugs being imported to African countries comprise largely 90% of what is consumed on the continent annually. And that's a fundamental problem in terms of sustainability. And so that should concern us all and think of ways to get out of that. 2, depending on these imports, it's not only problematic in terms of the economy itself, since we're going to buy, you have citizens that are exposed to vulnerabilities that are associated with shortages related to medical supplies. And what that has shown us more recently is that with the COVID-19 pandemic, you have governments, countries where production is taking place, deciding not to send out supplies related to COVID-19 because they needed those supplies for themselves, leaving the Africans alone. Luckily enough, I think the impact of COVID-19 on the continent hasn't been as bad as otherwise you would notice in Europe or in Americas. Third, making sure that manufacturing happens here in Africa, it's essential. And in this case, it helps us in building a robust health systems, because then without developing our own systems in terms of those supplies, you really have issues or deficits in your health system as a continent. And with health system comes improvement in well-being, right? So if you invest enough resources in the health system, you are able to generate benefits that would accrue to the population in terms of reducing costs and access to those supplies. We are also in a continent where the opportunity is just vast in terms of investment in pharma manufacturing. You have this for businesses, benefiting them, but also benefiting the populations that would receive those supplies on the continent. And so there's money to be made and there are lives to be saved. So why are imports a concern? I have already expressed this in the other slides, but more generally, imports are costly. And so if you're somebody who's concerned about your economy and making sure you work on prosperity, generating more revenue for the people and for the country, importing supplies is not a good idea. And then you have limited access to quality supplies, which in this case subjects our citizen to what I had already stated, vulnerabilities associated with disruptions in terms of supply chain. You have the continent where half of the population lack access to those basic supplies. And you also have lack of access to essential medicines, which in this case contributes to death of millions of Africans annually, particularly poor households, children and women. And then you have quality related issues. And it would be, I thought it would be essential to sort of relate my own experience in South Sudan. So I have a friend of mine who went to a pharmacy to look for a medicine for headaches. And she was given this dose of medicine that was written in a foreign country. And fortunately, the pharmacist could not interpret the dosage itself in terms of whether or not it's 20 mgs or 30 mgs, because the other language is not understood in South Sudan. And there was a fight over whether or not the patient should take the medicine. The patient, my friend, ended up being kicked out of the pharmacy because she did not want to take the medicine that she did not understand, whether or not there would be an issue there. So quality is a fundamental problem with imports. So this brings me to, I don't know what's happening with. So this brings me to opportunity. So what's the opportunity in this? The opportunity is that Africa is a market for manufacturing in terms of pharmaceutical products now than it ever was. And that is because half of the population has no access to those basic supplies. The industry over the years has appreciated. And as a result, you're looking at money being made in the tune of up to $65 billion by 2020. And that's an opportunity that should be harvested. So what is driving the opportunity in this respect? You have a continent that is rapidly urbanizing. You have more towns developing in South Sudan, where I'm based. You have more people moving to the urban centers. And those citizens who are moving from the rural areas or countryside to the urban centers are going to seek improved health services. And pharmaceutical supplies are going to be key in this respect. Then you have the healthcare capacity, which is improving, probably not in South Sudan yet, but in a bunch of other African countries. So in the region, for example, Ethiopia or Kenya, you have considerable improvements there. And those also drive the need for basic supplies in terms of pharmaceutical industry, supplying those to healthcare workers and facilities and to individual consumers. And then you have the business environment, which is improving. And in this case, you're looking at a number of countries that have adopted policies that control the market itself, the prices, restrictions related to quality. And South Africa is a good example. And this is a space for opportunity, considering that if you invest in a place like South Africa, you're going to make your money and you will reward the population by giving you the space to invest. So this brings me to the actions that would need to be undertaken in support of former manufacturing industry on the continent. The first is recognizing that foreign governments are no longer, especially during pandemics, are no longer easily amenable to supplying other settings with their supplies. They would produce first for their population, and then there's leftover, they will be able to send whatever is left to this other settings. This is an opportunity for Africa. What that means is that there should now be an interest across the board to advocate for building this manufacturing industry for our own continent. Policymakers and policy discourses on the continent, which are now taking place, are being geared towards promoting an increased domestic production of those essential drugs. And how you do that is by improving the industry itself. And I took the quote from this senior life sciences specialist at IMF, who says this localization of drug manufacturing would help health systems in Africa lessen the continent's vulnerability to supply chain disruptions. This is actually the key message there, that when there is a pandemic such as COVID-19, you need to have a robust system to respond to that. There are roughly 400 drug makers on the continent. Most of them are concentrated in North Africa. And what that tells us is that you're going to need to build such a system across the board to be able to supply the entire continent. That is not there now. So if you are going to work towards industrializing Africa with respect to pharmaceutical supplies, you're going to look at different corners that need immediate help. And this could be affected by looking at instruments that already exist. There is a pharmaceutical manufacturing plan, which is an instrument by African Union, and that it's still inadequate in terms of operationalizing it. And then you have making sure other initiatives are strengthened in order to achieve the same goal, and particularly looking at the African Vaccine Regulatory Forum, which then promoted the same objective, and that should be furthered as well. Governments in this respect need to prioritize regulatory reforms in order to attract investment. Investment is going to be key to an industry in this respect, and attracting those investors is going to be useful. You also have quality control, which would be required. That is required, and it could be implemented because production will be localized. In this case, you would guarantee safety as a result. And that's it from my part. Again, my intervention was more of motivating why this is important, as opposed to actually building into the argument the frameworks that are needed. So I'll leave it at that. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Dr. Manyai, and it's good the network did not disrupt you. Eventually, the perspective from South Sudan is much appreciated. Let's move along further. I think Eric from the FDA in Ghana is the one who will speak, who will be representing Ms. Dako. Is written here as FDA in Ghana. Are you here, Eric? Can you speak?
Yes, I'm online.
Please.
Can you hear me?
We can hear you and we can see you. Yes, go ahead.
Okay, good afternoon, everyone. Yeah, I'm here to talk about how the National Regulatory Authority in Ghana, the FDA, is trying to stimulate pharmaceutical manufacturing in the country. So,
Eric,
next.
if I may request, yeah, we can now see you. We can't see your face properly. We can only see a fraction of your head.
Can you see me now?
We can see you now. Please go ahead.
Okay. Also, so this is the outline of the presentation. That's the legal mandate of the FDA to regulate pharmaceutical manufacturing in Ghana. That's the incentive drivers, facilitators, and then the conclusion. So if you can make it to know. Can we move to the next slide, please? Okay, so this, now the FDA was established in August 1997 as the Food and Drugs Authority, board, and with a law, that's the PNDC law 305B, which was enacted in 1992. So this law was revised with time. This law was revised in the year 2012 And then we had the Public Health Act 851, which about three sections of that part, 6, 7, and 8, gives FDA the mandate to regulate drugs in this country. So that's the Food and Drugs Authority's mandated part 6, 7, and 8 of the Public Health Act to protect public health and safety. Can we go to the next slide, please? So there's a vision of the authority that's to protect public health and safety of people in Ghana and be a global center of excellence for food and medical product regulation. Our core values are integrity, accountability, and teamwork. And then the mission is the FDA exists to ensure the safety, quality, and efficacy of human and veterinary drugs, food, biological products, cosmetics, medical devices, household chemical substances, and clinical trials, and the control of tobacco products through the enforcement of relevant standards to protect public health. Yes, we protect public health, but we also try to stimulate manufacturing, because if a lot of manufacturing is done locally, you can have better control, and that implies that your people might have better access to public health, and in that case, you can protect better. Next slide. So that's why so like in Ghana, the Ghana FDA regulates the local manufacture of drugs under Section 115 of the Public Health Act 851, 2012. So now, currently, there are 32 drug manufacturing companies in Ghana that manufacture solid oral dosage liquid forms, oral liquids, dry powder for suspension, LVPs, and ophthalmic solutions, and then suppositories. 2 companies are in an advanced stage. 2 out of these 2 are in an advanced stage of manufacturing small volume parenterals. That's, the ampoules below 100 mils. But then when it comes to vaccine, as everybody was saying, we've all learned a lot from the COVID. So for now, there are 2 companies. One is a consortium made up of three companies out of these 32 with government support, and they are trying to fill, that's last step manufacturing, trying to fill this COVID vaccine from the messenger RNA vaccine from Pfizer BioNTech. So that will be filled locally and it will be distributed on the African continent. Then there's another one that's fully private, and that's also almost in advance, in more than 50%, trying to fill also vaccines, and then for also distribution on the continent. Next slide. So this is what I said about, and about these 32 companies, they're able to provide 30% of the country's drug needs. Then the remaining 70% are imported from the world, about over 50% of that one coming from Asia, India being the most, and then the rest remaining coming from mainly the European Union, over little coming from the United States of America. Yeah, can we go to the next slide, please? So, in order to get investments into your country, in order for any country to have a local vibrant pharmaceutical industry, definitely there will have to be incentives. But then the incentives, we know some would have to come from the central government, and NRAs also have a lot of they have a very big role to play, which I would just talk about what has happened in Ghana within the recent time, and which is leading to a little bit of improvement and giving us hope. Yeah, when it comes to like incentive to industry, like from the central government, we might say tax reduction on equipment and starting materials. There's the API, excipients, and packaging materials. Then in Africa, we all know utility, constant supply of water and electricity is a very big challenge on the continent. And if you don't have them at that affordable prices, and it's erratic, it's going to affect your manufacturing and you will never ever be competitive. And also we say government are supposed to create investor-friendly pathway for investors with the requisite capital and technical know-how to partner local manufacturers. And then tax holidays for local companies that build new CGMP compliant plants. So this, you can see that this mostly will come from the policy makers, not policy implementers. But then when it comes to the regulatory, as Dr. Agostino said, yes, we are saying we want to manufacture vaccines, if you don't have the regulatory capacity to control or to regulate what is being manufactured, I'm sure you wouldn't make any good progress, because for all manufacturers, no matter where they are, without proper regulation, they will do whatever they want, and And when they are doing whatever they want, of course, GMP will be compromised. And when GMP compromised, that should tell you that you'll be putting the public as in danger. And one, from the regulatory side, what do you want to do? If somebody comes to set up a plant in your factory, put in an application, and it will take about 12 months. There's a country here in West Africa, I'm not going to mention the name. An investor has put a plant there for over 2 years, and they've not even given the company the license to go ahead to manufacture. Why? That they are now reviewing the dossiers. I mean, this is a total disincentive to local manufacturer. You wouldn't get any manufacturer coming to your country to manufacture, not trying to put up a plant and manufacture. So like from the regulatory point of view, that's national regulatory authorities are supposed to have transparent and enhanced registration procedures with clear timelines. If they know that they put in the application and within 6 months, all things being equal, they can get the application, why not? But you who invest millions of dollars and put in an application and wait for 2 years. Can we go to the next slide, please? And from the experience on the West African subcontinent, you can have all the best machinery, buy the best starting materials as API and excipients. If you don't have the people to formulate, you will not get a good product. And we can see that the critical mass of experts on the continent is extremely very low. I don't know about South Africa, I don't know about Egypt, but for almost the other African countries, you go, there are few countries that have industries, you go there, you see that they have to bring expatriates from mainly Southeast Asia and then Southern Asia to come and man these plants. And what is being done about it? So like in Ghana, what has been done is the FDA has created an industrial support department. We've created an industrial support department because like we have over the past 20 years, we've built capacity in-house. We've sent people, people who have gone to do their masters in pharmaceutical technology and also done a lot of industrial attachments. And now these people are part of the agency, but then solely their job description is to help industry with respect to their conceptual, their designs, building of their plants, and then formulation, and also building, preparing pharmaceutical dossiers. And to mitigate this conflict of interest, the people in this department have nothing to do with any application or ongoing activities in the authority. Their focus is solely to help industry. And therefore, it's not possible they will see any application that they have felt prepared. And when I quite remember the FDA was being assessed for maturity level 3, WHO asked this question. And we were able to put in on, they could see that the activities could not affect, and the conflict of interest was well managed, and that did not affect the authority in achieving maturity level 3. So now this is definitely one way that regulatory authorities on this continent or in this continent can help stimulate industries in their country, because technically, I mean, most of the universities here don't train people well for industry. So that is one. So it's a creation of an industrial support by national regulatory authorities to help industry build capacity in the area of compliance to CGMP, especially, and the compilation of regulatory dossiers is very, very important due to the lack of critical mass of experts, especially in the chemistry, manufacturing, and control area. Bioequivalence, for a generic product, if it is not BCS class 1 and it's class 2 and class 3, class 2, 3, and 4, you'd have to establish bioequivalence through in vivo studies. That's by comparing the test and reference in humans. So if you don't have the regulatory capacity to do that, then that also becomes a problem. And then how do we then get experts in the continent? How do we get experts in the continent to help man our local industries so that it will curtail the importation of expatriates into the country, and most of the profits that the company make end up being exported out because they have to spend a lot of money on manpower, which is not available locally. And one thing that we think that is very, very important is the partnership between national regulatory authorities and academia, especially our pharmacy schools, to develop suitable curriculum, taking into account the local environment to train the requisite staff for industry, especially as research and development scientists, formulators who formulate the raw materials and excipients into products, QC analysts who develop methods and test the products, QA personnel, quality assurance people who would ensure that the quality management system are being implemented in a company to ensure that quality assured product and products are manufactured. And of course, pharmaceutical engineers, because utilities, we all know in modern GMP plants, of course, you would have to have a heating, ventilation, air conditioning, and water systems. And all these things need experienced and qualified people to maintain these systems. Can we go to the next slide? So who are the stakeholders? Of course, central government, we all know, as the previous speakers have said, what the central government have to do. NRAs, I've just said, NRAs will also have to help industry build capacity. Academia, that's bridging of the gap between academia and then industry, with the help of the regulatory authorities, also a very key way to go. And of course, the industries themselves, getting to know that in order to know quality is expensive, it's a continual process. And it's not just building the plant and putting the, you need to invest in training staff and also building capacity. I'm sure, next slide, I think this is the end of my presentation. So in conclusion, there's the need for a strong cohesion between the stakeholders mentioned above for the creation of a robust and viable local pharmaceutical manufacturing industry on the continent, especially sub-Saharan Africa. Mr. Chair, I'm done.
Thank you very much from this perspective, from Ghana perspective, from South Sudan perspective, from the Nigeria, from the Honorable Minister. Now I'm going to hand over to my colleague, Dr. Adingwe, who will take us through the next session, which is representing or introducing the discussants, and later on we'll allow those who are attending here to engage as well. Thank you, Dr. Adingwe.
Thank you very much, Busani, for your masterful handling of that session, especially juggling the power outages in South Africa and South Sudan simultaneously. Very well done. You've all heard the address from the Honorable Minister of State, Senator Olorunimbe Mamora. You also heard the snippets that were given by Lynn Morris when she gave her own statement introducing the minister. And Busani took us through three very different but equally enlightening presentations. You had the chair of SSS in the School of Governance, Professor Van der Veer, talk about business versus social good, talk about proactive regulatory approvals, PPPs, and then the debate as regards how we undertake clinical trials on the continent. You then had Dr. Mayai, the managing director of Sud Institute in South Sudan, give us a new catchphrase, money to be made and lives to be saved, MTML 2S. And I think that captured very, very succinctly the motivation that he indicated was key for us to begin to look at things differently as regards how we manufacture. And then he capped it off with the presentation by Eric, who's representing Ms. Daku. Now, for those of you who don't know, Ghana has one of the highest maturity levels on the continent. And in the past few years, they've done very well in moving their industry using a mix of incentives and regulatory activities. So I think we've tried, I think just a lot of you don't know that one of the most difficult tasks that Nzu, Nomfundo, and myself had at the very beginning when we were conceptualizing this was selecting a group of people who could add flavor in a way that hadn't been seen on the continent. And I think these three presentations have have captured very, very well the initial sentiments we wanted this particular section to capture. And so we're going to now move on to the discussants very quickly. And we have three key discussants who will be allowing to review what has been presented. The first of them is the president of the Afrexim Bank, President Professor Benedict Orama, who unfortunately, even though he really wanted to be here, was not able to join us at the last moment, but he sent his right hand, Adam Abdelal, who in his own right is a doyen in the AFCFTA relations and trade policy aspects in the Afrexim Bank. So he will be the first person who will be giving the floor to discuss. He will be followed very quickly by Dr. Janet Garuhanga, who is the Senior Program Officer at AUDA NIPRD. She's been on the continent in policy making for over 2 decades, and the PMPA that has been lauded at the early part of this discussion, I know her fingerprints are also on that document. And then the last person we'll be bringing in to discuss will be Mr. Stephen Hannibal, who is the Deputy Director General of Trade, Industry and Competition in South Africa. As you heard the 3 presenters mention earlier on, the key aspects of this particular discussion where trade, industry, and competition really have to be engaged on. So these are the 3 key people who we will bring on board to discuss the presentation so far. So I'm going to begin with Mr. Adam, who's representing Professor Benedict Orama. And so Mr. Adam Abdelal, you're welcome. You're on the floor. I can see you. Good to see you again. Let me start by asking you, Adam, you heard the 3 presentations, and I know you're very well versed as regards how AFCFTA will either stimulate an improvement in local pharmaceutical manufacturing. In the interest of transparency, Adam was part of the team who we engaged with when NIPRD won a recent grant on active pharmaceutical ingredients manufacturing. So Adam, I'll let you have the floor for 10 minutes, and I want you to tell us how this discussion on developing Africa's pharmaceutical manufacturing capacity can be stimulated by the very recent agreement which was signed a couple of years ago and I think was ratified last year. How will AFCFTA fast track African pharmaceutical manufacturing? Adam, you have the floor.
Well, thank you very much, Dr. Obi, for giving me the floor and inviting the bank to speak at this important event. Unfortunately, Professor Benedict Orama is not available, but I'll be representing the bank on his behalf. Distinguished ladies and gentlemen, the flagship project of the African Union, the African Continental Free Trade Area, is truly a collective African ambition that has been the dream of many of the African forefathers to have an integrated African market with free movement of goods and services between African nations. And the purpose of the AFCFTA is really to promote industrial development on the continent through harmonizing and facilitating trade between African countries in goods and in services. And I would like to perhaps speak a little bit about my past experience. Before I actually joined the bank, I was a commercial attaché for the Egyptian government in West Africa. I served in Senegal for 3 years and in Cote d'Ivoire for 2 years. And one of the sectors I was mainly focusing on is the pharmaceutical sector, because many of the West African nations, unfortunately, rely heavily on imports of pharmaceuticals, medical devices, medical supplies, as well as cosmetics. So it was an important and also a lucrative opportunity for the Egyptian manufacturers to engage in trade with Senegalese and Ivorian counterparties. However, the problem in when it comes to trade between these two countries or these two regions is very high import and customs duties. And this is what the AFCFTA is really trying to address. It's to eliminate the tariff barriers and the technical barriers between African nations in order to really promote trade and also provide a necessary and important products such as the pharmaceutical supplies to these nations. It is also important to note that the African Continental Free Trade Area aims to harmonizing policy procedures and standards. And this is where the African Export-Import Bank has made a lot of interventions, especially by providing a grant to the ARSO Foundation to work on harmonization of standards in the pharmaceutical sector, and also to facilitate the production of pharmaceutical products. And I would like to also take this opportunity to highlight some of the interventions that the bank has done in the pharmaceutical and health industry in Africa, which include several facilities to increase the number of beds in hospitals in Uganda, in Liberia, and as well as Nigeria. We've also launched the African Medical Center of Excellence, which Nigeria has actually won through a competitive bid. The African Medical Center of Excellence will offer a full spectrum of medical services from diagnostics to inpatient and outpatient, oncology, cardiology, as well as general healthcare services. And this will be in the Federal Capital Territory in Abuja. The center will also provide research and development capabilities to ensure it remains at the leading edge in clinical services. This is just touching quickly upon what the bank has done. And also another thing that we have done last year and ongoing this year is that we have provided a $2 billion guarantee to facilitate the vaccine acquisition by African countries. And we have actually secured 220 million doses of Johnson & Johnson vaccine to the continent. And following on this project, we have actually created the African Medical Supply Platform, which allows the aggregation of purchase orders by governments, and we aggregate through one purchase in order to lower the price. And we have success stories in Madagascar that we were able to reduce the cost of the unit by 98%. This is a solution actually for many African countries that are small in population. So we look, for example, like a country, Burundi, compared to Nigeria. The number of orders by Burundi is going to be much, much less than the number of orders by Nigeria. And hence the price offered to Burundi will be much higher. And through this platform, we are actually guaranteeing the provision of vaccines at very low prices. I'm sorry I deviated a bit from your question, but I thought it was very important for us to really understand how the bank is engaging in Pan-African collaboration with other African organizations, including as well a memorandum of understanding which is signed with the African Finance Corporation to develop vaccine manufacturing in Africa. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you very much, Adam. I'm going to have my partner send the bill for the advertisement you've done for the bank. Very well done there. However, there were key things you mentioned which is of value to what we're discussing here today. So the Pan-African AMS platform that has been put together, those are the kind of interventions that we will be looking at using when we're looking at pooling resources in terms of re-engineering how medicines are produced. So we've taken away aspects of where the challenges are, things like duties, harmonization of standards. And we've also taken away from you, Adam, the fact that whilst we're battling things like an inordinate dependence on importation, we should also be battling things like medical tourism. And you've mentioned 3 or 4 interventions which the bank has done. And I quite like how you put the fact that there are research and development projects embedded in all your centers of excellence. Everyone knows that R&D is the beginning of local manufacturing on the continent. So thank you very much, Adam, on those interventions. Please don't go away, just in case we need to touch base with you again before the call is ended. Let me now move on very swiftly to Dr. Janet Garuhanga. I think Janet on the platform. I think she's on the platform. I saw someone who looked like her earlier on. Janet has been with AUDA and has been in policy making at the continental level for a few decades now. So we're quite privileged to have someone with her experience. Now, Janet, you've heard people mention the PMPA. I know your fingerprints are on that document, but based on your background from Edinburgh and your background as a medical personnel, I'd like you to give us some insight as regards the role of clinical trials in us developing a homegrown pharmaceutical manufacturing sector that can address the healthcare issues in Nigeria, in Africa, sorry. So you have 10 minutes. Just can you first begin by giving us some insights as regards why we are not where we are in terms of homegrown clinical trials, contextualizing clinical trials, and then give us pointers as to 2 or 3 things that can be done on the continent to reverse that so that we can have that aspect of the pharmaceutical manufacturing value chain ticked off. Janet, you have the floor.
Thank you so much, Dr. Obi, and thank you all the organizers of this very important event. And Dr. Obi, before I actually dive into the clinical trials question, can you just allow me to give my perspectives on what the continent's vision is with regard to the subject matter of this meeting, which was mainly the issue of how we can manufacture viably, right, sustainably and in a viable manner, products, pharmaceutical products on this continent and improve the different indices of public health, but as well the economy is growing. In African Union, as you rightly said, we have designed a strategy at a continental level that governments who are interested in building pharmaceutical capability need to look at, examine and see whether they can develop these frameworks at a national and regional level, whereby we can be able to then harness the results that we are seeking for or we desire to see on the continent in terms of availing the quality medical products, improving the access to those medical products, ensuring that they are affordable to the people who need them the most. And then on the other hand, as industry, ensure that the industry that we are developing is really competitive, it can sustain the production, and it's self-reliant, especially with the lessons that we have learned from the COVID and other pandemics like Ebola that have affected this continent, and in the manner in which we have responded to them. So what is very important, and one of the speakers, I think it was Alex, did mention that it's important to ensure that there is some level of policy involvement across the value chain of manufacturing, where you have the right policies working together, not only the health policy, but the industrial policy, as well as, and I want to add to what he said, to the industrial policy, I want to add science and technology and innovation, policies. I want to add finance and economic planning. I want to add trade. All those policies must be coherent and speaking towards how we can improve the manufacturing ecosystem on the continent. At the same time, apart from the policies being coherent, the countries that are interested in this phenomenon do not have to all, I mean, not all 54 countries need to engage in manufacturing medical products because that's not going to be viable. What we need is the countries that have expressed interest and are demonstrating commitment. We need to help them develop sound sector strategies that are able to maintain and a viable industry in this space, which is we also understand is highly skilled and high tech, because we need the technology, but it doesn't come free. How are we able within the ecosystem to absorb the technology that we want to be transferred to this continent? How are companies able to absorb this technology? How prepared are we in terms of the R&D, in terms of the positioning of the plant and all of the requirements that we're talking about, the clinical trials that you're saying, how able are we to permanently or like sustainably offer the regulatory frameworks that are harmonized and that can attract investments in this space? How are our partnerships? Are they strategic enough? Are they really addressing the issues, or are they biased towards the West or the North? Are we able to really localize these partnerships and ensure that they are meaningful, they're transparent, and they are building capacity for this continent by, first of all, as we establish these partnerships, because this conference again is about collaborative framework, Pan-African collaborative frameworks that can work. And if the partners that are seated around this table are not strategic enough, they are hampering progress in improving the ecosystem for manufacturing, because as partners, we need to know where is our competitive and comparative advantage and harness that in order for the collaboration to work and be meaningful and make progress. Because right now, as we sit, you find it very hard, and I've been in this field for quite a long time, Dr. Obi, you may know that. We have been trying as much as possible to build consensus around a coordinated, systematic coordination of all the efforts towards promoting the local manufacture of medicines. And it has taken us so long, but thanks to COVID and the impact globally, the continent has woken up, and now some countries have expressed interest. We need to harness that momentum and make sure that the countries like the ones that the colleagues have mentioned that, for example, are already trying to bring in the mRNA technology to their countries, that we support them to access the market after they have all these facilities, because at the end of the day, these things will not be viable if they begin to produce these vaccines and they have no market to put them through. So if we don't develop those frameworks for collaboration and cooperation that are meaningful, that work and are not just expressed in word, but rather modeled and actually implemented across the regions. This SCFTA we are talking about, it's important that we make sure that the SCFTA does what it has to do. The bank does what it has to do. AUDA NEPA does what it has to do as per their mandate and comparative and competitive advantage. The private sector does what they have to do. The public sector, where the ministries, the policymakers are, do what they have to do in terms of policies that are conducive, in terms of creating the right incentives, in terms of protecting, promoting, and ensuring that public health is the indices are changing on the continent, and that the products are procured in a more comprehensive and meaningful business-wise way, because the MSP platform that has been created, and I'm speaking this from the way I have been observing how it has operated, we need to get a full report on the advantages this platform has created and how we can move it beyond collecting vaccines for the COVID and move it to other essential medical products that the countries of Africa need. How can we ensure that the countries buy into this type of platforms, actually have policies that are aligned with type of these platforms, have the legal instruments and regulatory systems that offer provisions for collaboration, for cooperation, for such kind of continent-wide and regional type of initiatives to be meaningful and useful and provide the necessary results. Coming to the clinical trials issue, at the African Union Development Agency, NIPRD, you are aware that we have a platform that is now currently resulting into the establishment of the African Medicines Agency. And in that platform, which has become the foundation for the AMA, which is the African Medicines Regulatory Harmonization Initiative, this platform has enabled the continent to bring the regulatory authorities together under one roof. All of the heads of agencies come together and they speak about how to move from maturity level 1 to maturity level 3, and all of those requirements eventually that are going to enable them to become, the system that allows us to be able to not only produce vaccines, but also other medical devices and other biologicals or APIs, as you may call them, those who are already endeavoring to manufacture APIs. Those are some of the areas of competitive advantage the continent has if we have an integrated, coordinated, and systematic way of collaborating. And the purpose of this meeting is not to reiterate the problems, but rather to bring about solutions on the collaborative issues, because that's where the problem lies. We know the problem, we know the solutions, but when it comes to coordination, nobody wants to be coordinated. The Africa CDC doesn't want to be coordinated. The bank doesn't want to be coordinated. The NIPRD does not want to be coordinated. So all those entities, we need to see that everybody is doing what they need to do, and we're not just repeating ourselves and talking the whole range of problems and the whole range of solutions over and over, but rather sit in one room, agree on what each agency is capable of doing and do it, and start small with the smaller projects like the Partnership for African Vaccine Manufacturing that I've seen, the PAVM, I think you've heard of it. Start with small like that, build on that by having a collaborative framework that works. If the PAVM eventually works and we get the results that currently the Africa CDC is coordinating on this PAVM, we are going to see successes, but we must start small and start sooner. I think that is where I'm going to stop, Dr. Obi.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you very much, Janet, for your insights in that particular area. I remember, not with much fondness, the cross-African travels we did over the past few decades whilst fighting for local manufacturing. And I'm glad you've risen to the level where you're now sitting in a very comfortable office and sending other people like us to do the cross-country travel. Well, very, very good insights there in terms of a framework, in terms of the need to focus on sustainability. I think one of the very key things which our rapporteurs will take away is that there is the greatest need perhaps is for policy alignment, policy synergy, and policy coherence across various platforms, and the need for there to be better collaboration. And I think in this particular conference, we've done very well there. I think we've been able to bring in speakers from the 4-5 regions on the continent. And we've also been able to bring in speakers from the various disciplines in healthcare that speak to pharmaceutical manufacturing development. So I think using the model that has been developed in this particular collaboration, we can begin to put something down for the continent to copy when it comes to developing solutions. So thank you very much again, Janet, for your intervention. And please don't go away. We just have about 45 minutes left on this program, and we may need to touch base with you again. So it brings me to Stephen Hannibal, the Deputy Director General on Trade, Industry and Competition in South Africa. You heard Janet mention in the last intervention that very often we look at pharmaceutical manufacturing from a narrow prism of either healthcare or pharmaceutical interventions. And that's the wrong way to look at it. There is a need for us to begin to look at synergies from finance, from funding, from trade, from intellectual property, from health policies, and from industry. And it is, one would argue that the biggest basket of the interventions that would help stimulate this sector on the continent would come from industry, trade, and competition. You also heard the professor that spoke earlier on from the SSS in Wits mention that there is a need for us to look at business versus social good. And then you heard our colleague from Ghana and the colleague from South Sudan talk about import restrictions. So you have 10 minutes to do what I would argue is the hardest job among the discussants. Stephen, I'd like you to give us in 10 minutes what you think would be contextually the key 10 incentives from your perspective that will help take Africa from where we are today to where we need to be in the next 5-10 years in terms of manufacturing life-saving medicines for our people. Stephen, you have the floor for 10 minutes.
Good evening, Dr. Obi, and thank you very much to the organizers of the webinar for inviting the Department of Trade, Industry and Competition to be part of this important discussion. My apologies, I'm sitting in the dark. We've been load shed in the area that I reside, so my apologies for that. And let me also acknowledge all the really excellent presentations and inputs from colleagues on the call, and all protocol observed. I know that there are many distinguished guests on the platform as well. So Dr. Obi, I think you've given me quite a tough task. I'd like to start perhaps by just giving a little bit of context in terms of a small case study of, let's say, South Africa's experience during the pandemic. And let me start by saying that, as I'm sure many of the colleagues on the call know, South Africa is quite an import-intensive economy. If you look at imports as a percentage of GDP, it's hovering at about 24–25%, and that compares very poorly with even parts of the continent, but certainly a significantly higher import intensity than our middle-income trading partners in, for example, Latin America, South America, parts of Asia. The European Union, for that matter, has an import penetration level of about 14–15%. So South Africa imports a lot. That varies from manufacturing goods, from capital equipment, high-tech machinery, and obviously pharmaceuticals and medical devices are a very large part of our import basket. And I think what brought home to us the seriousness of the COVID pandemic was when in early 2020, India announced that it was going to be imposing export restrictions on active pharmaceutical ingredients, which many developing countries, South Africa included, import. Including, I should mention, even something as basic as a paracetamol drug normally used for things like headaches and general pain and fever. And I think that really galvanized many parts of the South African government into beginning to think differently about industrial policy and how we support strategic critical sectors. So, of course, you know, one response would have been to look for other import partners. However, the South African government took a slightly different approach. And I think it was a good example of the entrepreneurial state, because many ministers and senior officials in national government were directed to actually go and speak to firms, to go and speak to practitioners, to speak to our labor, our trade union movements, and to try and really galvanize large parts of society around what we in South Africa like to call social compacts, but which are actually very much like the, in a sense, it's the label for the collaborative, synergistic relationships that other speakers have talked about this evening. So we went out and we tried to get some of these social compacts going, and the outcome of those social compacts were in many cases very interesting. For example, South Africa had the capacity to produce maybe 5% of the surgical mask needs at the start of the pandemic or just before the pandemic. Towards the end of what we call the third wave in South Africa, we've gone from, perhaps producing somewhere in the order of about 500,000 masks, surgical masks, N95 masks per month, to having the capacity to produce 33 million N95 masks per month. The interesting element of that is that towards the end of 2021, probably around about October or so, our actual production was around about 2 million surgical masks. So the obvious question that I think many of the colleagues on the call will want to know is, firstly, how is it possible to get that capacity in place? But perhaps more importantly, why was the actual production in October 2021 only somewhere in the order of about 2 million or so masks? And before getting to the answer to that, I want to perhaps just take a moment to talk a little bit about what we saw as some of the key success factors of being able to ramp up production capacity quite so significantly. And it cuts across surgical masks, it cuts across surgical gowns, even ventilators, which South Africa had not produced in any form pre the COVID pandemic. We eventually were able to produce somewhere in the order of about 20,000 fairly simple ventilators or CPAP machines. And I think one of the key elements that I would want to pull out is, firstly, the presence of lead firms. And we're incredibly fortunate in South Africa that we have a very small number of firms that are, I think it's fair to say, quite visionary in what they're trying to achieve in the economy. And so we were able to draw on that capacity and work with those individual firms to look at how to process their production facilities, re-engineer some of the activities that they were intending to undertake to really shift into some of the critical markets and some of the critical production activities that were going to respond directly to the pandemic. And there are a couple of areas that we think were really critical, but they were typically led by those private sector lead firms, which were able to engage both government, organized labor, different parts of national government, and to quite a significant extent, some of the key role players across South African society to really move forward on some of those areas. There were other interventions as well, interventions around providing incentives, and there's been a question on the chat around provision of incentives. I think that was obviously very important, not as perhaps important as providing a stable policy environment and getting the ecosystem for industrial production right. And I think many countries on the continent have tried special economic zones. In South Africa, the experience with special economic zones is perhaps uneven as well, but I do think it's fair to point out that the ecosystem that has been created in those special economic zones has helped to get some manufacturing going and has really been, I think, quite a key factor. Of course, a number of speakers have talked about coordination and the extent to which you've needed to get different policy instruments, different policy parts of government to talk. I think it's absolutely essential. In our case, we were able to get competition policy managed in a way that allowed firms to talk to one another, to talk about their production capabilities and capacity, and what needed to be put in place to address supply chain shortages and disruptions as those arose. So I think that was certainly another really critical area. I think the final point that I'd want to make, Dr. Obi, is one of the issues that has come out very clearly for us, and I alluded to it earlier when I talked about our production capacity, but our actual production. And it talks to something that a number of the presenters touched on earlier, which is really around economies of scale, effectively. What we found is, initially, it may well be the case that production locally is a little bit more expensive than importing from the rest of the world. But you have to look at that within the view of economies of scale and the spillover impacts in other parts of the economy. And so for us, we found that actually, although initially production was more expensive locally, over time that has declined to such an extent that in many cases, local production is actually cheaper than being able to import, leaving aside all of the supply chain disruptions and the risk of supply chain disruptions that come when you are an import-intensive economy. So I think for us, the critical factor is really thinking quite analytically and carefully about, I think it was Professor van den Heever that alluded to this, the cost of localization, the cost of local production on the continent. And in many cases, when you look at it over time, the economies of scale of local production are very much in favor of African countries. I think one of the previous speakers alluded to there's lots of money to be made on the continent at the moment. And I think we need to look at that within a package of, do we take a short-term view of it's a little bit more expensive to produce locally today, but potentially much more efficient and much cheaper to produce locally in the next 3 to 5 to 10 years. And so for us, that's a really critical part of the equation that needs to be quite carefully considered. So thank you very much, Dr. Obi. I think I'll stop there.
Thank you very much, Stephen. I let you run over by a few minutes because on that very last point, you were preaching to the bishop. I've always and will always be for local manufacturing, despite however expensive it seems at the beginning. In the long run, you can't argue with medicine security, you can't argue with job creation, you can't argue with capacity building, technology transfer, and all the other advantages that local manufacturing brings to the continent. Just a few statements to bring home Stephen's great points. Now, in addition to incentives like tax breaks, single-digit financing, stable policy environment, dedicated farmer parks and related infrastructure, we also need to consider things like PPPs, medicine security, and I think the one that was that was most interesting to me is the impact of the social compact. Very often people in the northern part of the world don't understand when we talk about things like family, Ubuntu, social compact, community. And I think Stephen brought home that point very well. On this very note, I have been harassed by Nomfundo to keep it to a minimum, but I was really, even though I know this sector very well, I was very excited by all the new knowledge that's coming out from the great presentations and equally stimulating discussions that were provided by our delegates who were on the call. Thank you all very much for your contributions, and permit me now to yield the floor to Nomfundo for the next segment. Nomfundo, you have the floor.
Thank you very much, Obi, and many thanks to the excellent speakers. Firstly, Obi, I harassed you because you unilaterally extended the time of the session. I heard you say 45 minutes when we had 18 minutes left at the time. We were scheduled to finish at 7 South African time, which is actually in 4 minutes. But I'm seeing, for example, in the chat, somebody's saying, Chinadum Peace Babalola is saying, basically saying that the passion of the speakers is coming through, especially for local manufacturing. Your own passion will be truly coming through. And I'm hoping that that passion can sustain us and allow us to extend the session by another 15 minutes. So I also see that we haven't really had any attrition, or very little, of participants. So I think there's a lot of interest in this topic, and I hope the panelists are also okay for us to just extend it by another 15 minutes to 7:15 South African time, just to allow people the opportunity to make some inputs. I'm going to request that if anybody has a question, and if it's directed at a specific speaker, won't you please just type it in the chat and indicate who it's directed at, so that I can read the question out and ask the panelists to respond. But I think before we do that, or while people get their questions ready, I'm going to ask Stavros to please come in. Stavros Nicolaou, I think is well known to many of us, done a lot of work on the continent, as well as here in South Africa, as a senior executive at Aspen, but also very involved in just assisting with this discussion of developing Africa's manufacturing capacity. And Stavros, I specifically would like to ask you to just expand a bit on this last comment about economies of scale. And I know in previous sessions, for example, at the business school last week, you were discussing the challenges of actually accessing those economies of scale beyond just Africa. The issues, for example, of procurement by some of the biggest manufacturers, whether it's development agencies of the developed countries, or Gavi, for example. If you can just talk a little bit more about that and how that can address this challenge of economies of scale. And I think the second question that I'd like you to address is, I know one that's somewhat more political, but I think the fact of the matter is, one of the greatest challenges that we face in any African initiative is that when things or opportunities arise and we see the need for collaboration, we talk about it, but as soon as we're done talking, we then start going into our silos and focus on which country is going to get what. And ultimately, you've got all 55 countries rushing for the same opportunity, instead of being more strategic about how we pull our strength together. So I'd like you to just reflect a little bit on what you raised at a previous discussion about being realistic about our approach. If we have to have effective collaboration, you've alluded to the fact that we may need to have a more regional approach. So looking at hubs rather than 55 manufacturers. If you've given any more thought to how those hubs can function in a way that is actually accommodating to as many countries as possible, won't you please reflect on that? In addition, of course, to anything that you may have wished to raise. Thank you. I'm going to switch my camera off because, much like Stephen, ESCOM has decided to bring darkness into my life. So I am actually hotspotting and I am using a mobile light. So I'm going to switch off so that I save my battery. Thank you.
Great. Thanks very much. So I'm in the dark as well, but hopefully this session has been enlightening. So hopefully it will shine a few spotlights that need to be shone in. Let me try and address one or two of the spotlights as sort of building on the comments that you made earlier. But firstly, let me just also acknowledge the organizers and thank you for this opportunity to make a few short inputs. The starting point for me is that Africa has the most disproportionate disease burden of any continent in the world. And yet we remain chronic and serial importers of medicine. Now, that doesn't make sense. Put differently, imagine if we were the biggest consumers and drivers of motor vehicles and we imported all of it. It would make no sense. I mean, in those markets where you have high volumes, those countries produce those products, whatever it is, whether it's a car or a medicine or any other product for that matter. So put differently, colleagues, Africa has outsourced all its pharmaceutical volumes to other continents, primarily India, to a lesser extent China, and to some extent the United States and Europe. So for me, that is the starting point that we need to address. Why do we so merrily outsource these volumes? You outsource these volumes, of course, aside from the obvious things that you are creating employment, job skills, taxes, productive capacity elsewhere, but you're also putting yourself at a significant disadvantage during a pandemic, as we've just experienced now. The past 24 months, we've all been exposed to various ebbs and flows. Some of the most disappointing moments when we were subject to export restrictions and we could not get in medicines. We had very little or no capacity to produce vaccines, and we found ourselves at the back of the queue as the African continent. So that's just a context to what I'm going to respond directly to in terms of the questions you've just asked. So I think the first thing is, let's talk a little about economies of scale. Now, individually, the 55 countries don't have economies of scale, and manufacturing is all about economies of scale. If you don't have scale, you're never going to be competitive. Now, 55 disparate markets individually do not give you any scale. However, if you add 55 markets, you aggregate them, then you're starting to get a scale that begins to compete with the volumes in Asia, Europe, etc., etc. So the one of the sort of, seeing that we're being thematic around light and power, one of the lights at the end of the tunnel is that Africa, for the first time in the midst of this pandemic, has realized the value of having manufacturing or capacity on our own continent. And I should probably attribute much of this to the leadership of President Cyril Ramaphosa, both in his capacity as president of the AU, but also now as the AU COVID champion. And a team of people he appointed as envoys, ably led by Straub Masiyiwa, the bank, African Bank, Professor Rama, who would have spoken here but has been ably represented. All of these people got together and said, well, kind of enough is enough. Let's utilize our own volumes to get scale. And we saw the establishment of a platform which now starts to consolidate the volumes on the continent. What this will mean is that we are now placing ourselves as a continent in a much stronger negotiating position. And when you do that, you're able to start driving the agenda, driving the narrative with the WTO, WHO, and other multilateral organizations, but also those companies that are traditionally licensors or hold the intellectual property right. And many of you would have seen, as a consequence of this, my own company, where I am, Aspen Pharma, last night announced a pivotal, and it was actually a monumental moment for Africa, the first licensing rights for a COVID vaccine that was transferred to Aspen by Johnson & Johnson. This gives Africa its first COVID vaccine. So there's tremendous value to realizing that volume economies of scale are critical to putting yourself in a negotiating position, whether it's intellectual property that you're discussing or manufacturing and building capacity on the continent. Let me just very briefly, because I don't want to hog the floor, just touch two other aspects and then I'll close. So this kind of what I've just said segues into the next issue. And it speaks to the need for sustainable volumes. So part of the reason Africa hasn't got capacity is because we've largely been a continent of handouts. So we're very dependent on multilateral procurement agencies and donor fund agencies. So as much as we are, happy to receive donations and they're most welcome, donations also deindustrialize a country and or a continent. And this is what we've seen, because we've been so busy receiving these handouts, we forgot to build an industry for ourselves. And the more you receive these handouts, the more that you're again leveraging out to outsourcing your volumes to India in particular. So we need to bring those volumes back. But now if we put up capacities, as is now happening on the continent, and I can tell you Aspen in itself has produced 180 million doses of COVID vaccine under contract manufacturing with J&J. But the trick here becomes sustaining these capacities. Now, far too often the continent has put up capacities, they are not supported, and we land up downsizing or mostly shutting them down. So we cannot afford this, because if there's anything we've learned from this pandemic is that local capacities solve local problems. So not if, but when the next pandemic manifests, we've got to make sure that Africa is ready immediately. We're in the ball game immediately. We have our capacities that we turn on at that point in time. We don't wait for the end of a pandemic and then turn on those capacities. So sustaining these capacities means that the multilateral procurement agencies, as you mentioned, the Gavis, the COVAXs, the AVATs, our colleague from African Bank is on the line. We need to ensure that these agencies and or donor funds procure directly from African manufacturers so that we sustain the capacities on the continent. We lose these capacities, we're back to square one, we're back at the end of the queue again. We simply can never afford that again. We've seen the devastating consequences, both in lives and livelihoods, when this happens. So just to round off on that point, we have to continue calling for and agitating for a change in the multilateral procurement dynamics. We cannot afford to have white elephants on the continent. I think Africa is known for African elephants. We shouldn't be known for white elephants because we put these facilities up and our very own people and all the agencies don't buy from them. So critical that we start buying from our own local producers to sustain these capacities. Very lastly, I just want to mention one very quick thing here about, we hear this thing that if you buy local, there's a premium to be paid, and you prejudice the fiscus and you prejudice society at large. I don't agree with that. That's a very simplistic argument that gets put forward. And unfortunately, a lot of the procurement happens through these multilateral procurement agencies, but also through the national health departments or regional provincial health departments in the 55 countries on the continent. Okay. Why do I say it's a simplistic argument? Because the real way to look at this is when you produce locally, there's a significant multiplier effect back into the economy. And that very often outstrips any premium, if there is a premium to be paid. Stephen was quite correct, Stephen Hannibal earlier. He said that very often you find that the locally produced product is actually more cost effective and or competitive than an imported product. But that is an aside. If we continue with this very narrow narrative that many people are advancing, I even just saw with the CDE the other day, it's a very simplistic argument to say, well, you're going to pay R2 more per pack for your medicines, unaffordable, we can't do it. Well, maybe we're losing R10 back in revenue into the economy. So until and unless you do that exercise, and it has been done incidentally by the IDC and DTIC in the case of antiretrovirals many years ago, until you do that exercise, it's very simplistic just to say that we are going to, it's unsustainable to entertain a premium. So two things in closing. What we need here is we need economies of scale for the continent. We need to be the masters of our own destiny. We cannot continue being chronic and serial importers of medicine, as has been the case. We cannot continue creating markets elsewhere at the expense of our own people, their jobs, the skills, etc., and we lose the talent. We are developing fantastic scientists on the continent, only to lose them because we don't have these capacities and capabilities because we shut them down. We can no longer afford to do that. We have to sustain these capacities on the continent. And then secondly, we have to ensure the global procurement dynamics are changed. We cannot continue having our own volumes being procured out of the continent, and you are creating viable, robust industries elsewhere at the expense of our very own people and our own continent. So thanks very much. Those are just a couple of inputs. I'm most appreciative, and thanks for an excellent webinar, which has been well thought through and much enjoyed. Thanks very much. Back to you.
Thank you very much, Stavros, and thank you for agreeing just to share those insights. I'm going to take 3 questions and direct them specifically to individuals who answer, and then we close the session. I'm afraid we can't cater for all questions. There's one from an anonymous attendee, and I think, Stephen, you'd probably be best placed to answer this one, because it's actually talking about import substitution, because it says, I thought there were countries who have policies where if drug is produced locally, no imports are allowed. So that's why I say I think it's import substitution. And perhaps, Stephen, you can tell us if that's something that would even be feasible from a legal point of view, and from a WTO point of view. Can we do that where we substitute, where you don't allow imports, where you are manufacturing certain drugs? And then there's another question from Neil Cole, which is a public finance question. And Alex, I think you'd probably be very well placed to respond to this one. And it's talking about underinvestment by the private sector. And to sum it up, he's calling for public-private partnership that can actually start addressing some of the risks and benefits assessments that are done by the private sector that land Africa more on the risk side. So he's asking, basically, how do you make public-private partnerships more effective in making sure that we bring the 2 parties to dialogue and we start de-risking, or at least reducing the perception of African risk. But related to that is the role that must be played by public finance. So African governments have to play a role through public finance to assist in this de-risking. And I think this is more of a public goods question, really. How do we start looking at this manufacturing capacity more as a regional public good, so that we start catering for it in our regional public finance approaches, rather than just looking at it as we tend to do in public finance as silos, only doing your budgeting for your country, rather than looking at it as a regional public good. And then finally, I think the last question, Adam, being from Afri-Exim Bank, you'd probably be best placed to respond to it. On the challenges of R&D, so we've all had a discussion about how central R&D is to this discussion. But Philip Builders is saying that part of the challenge is that a lot of the R&D on the continent is grant dependent, and those grants tend to come from outside the continent. So what sustainable financing mechanisms can we actually develop so that we can actually contribute towards industrialization through our own domestic funding? I know there's been talks about philanthropy and its role in all of this, but clearly you need much larger sums of money, and I think Afri-Exim Bank may be well positioned to have this, to respond to this question. So first to Stephen, then to Alex, and then to Adam. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Namfundo. So I think the issue is perhaps a bit more complex than simply import substitution versus something else. I mean, it is the case that under the WTO, you can impose unusual tariffs for strategic product or during a public emergency, a public health crisis, for example. But I don't think that for most African countries, that's necessarily the best option, because we are dependent at the moment on imports and the technology that is embodied in those imports, particularly in the pharmaceutical and medical devices sector. So I think there's a little bit of nuance required in the sense of we need to localize those products that have the highest potential for us to produce competitively in South Africa or in the Southern Africa or in Africa more generally, and we have to look carefully at where that's possible and where it's not possible, because I think we do have to be sensitive that it's possible to impose an import restriction to protect a domestic producer, which then leads to the kinds of white elephants that Stavros was alluding to earlier. So I think we have to find quite a careful balance, and we have to acknowledge that certainly at the moment we do get imports that embody new technologies and latest technologies that the continent can benefit from. But of course, we do have to invest in R&D and invest in production facilities where learning takes place on the shop floor, and collaborate with countries on the continent to build that capability to be able to produce more locally and to develop those high-tech and leading-edge drugs, medical devices, and the like. So I think it needs to be a bit more nuanced than simply a return to import substitution industrialization. I do think that we've probably missed the opportunity to do that, and the cost of doing that now would be higher than the benefits. What we can certainly do, though, is build our capability to develop new drugs, new medical devices on the continent, and to aggregate demand so that we're able to build a few really internationally competitive pharmaceutical or medical device hubs where we're able to produce much more of what the continent needs and demands than is currently the case. So that would be my response, Nomfundo. Thank you so much again.
Thank you very much. Alex, do you want to quickly come in, please?
Yeah. So just on the question of how we can get people to invest domestically, I think the problem is quite complex. The main question is, so there's domestically and regionally, it's a question of markets and the development of scale, and whether or not you can get access to markets on some sort of exclusive basis so that you're able to generate scale. And in some cases, you can look at lowering the cost of production through subsidies, guaranteeing demand and purchase and offtake and so on to make sure that people have some can sell. The access to private markets is another matter because that's not controlled by governments. So that's an important part of demand in Africa, which would also influence investment and whether or not a subsidy to actually boost production, manufacturing will prove viable down the line. But there's also two types of investor. There's one who's basically investing in the products you're developing for the local and regional market. And there are those instances where you are essentially getting licenses. You're producing for somebody else with a license whose market is somewhere else in the world. And they're interested in margins. And so if your unit cost of production is higher than somewhere else in the world, they're not going to use your facility. So and their incentives might also be very difficult to control. So I think it is a complex issue. I think it's a dangerous issue for governments to get caught up in permanent, long-standing subsidies to industries that remain permanently unviable, which is one of the consequences of import substitution strategies with very narrow markets. But it might make a good sense in a public-private arrangement for strategic investments to boost production and leverage in particular areas. But I think it's not a very straightforward, there's no simple answer. But I think that what a government has to actively innovate in this area to achieve very clear objectives, which includes local innovation all the way into production and sale. And not just to focus on trying to get some large pharmaceutical manufacturer to use your factory. So it's a question as to what your ultimate objective is.
Great, thank you, Alex. And then finally, Adam.
Thank you very much. Well, there is no doubt that R&D is one of the most important and crucial components of pharmaceutical manufacturing, as it is important to provide powerful knowledge and insights. And it also leads to improvements of existing processes where efficiency can be increased and costs can be reduced. So there is no doubt in our mind that research and development should be an instrumental component of any health intervention that aims at improving the medical capacities and strengthening the medical resilience of African nations. And the bank has actually developed and deployed the African Medical Center of the African Medical Center of Excellence, in order to really be a pioneer in that area where we can provide state-of-the-art technologies and best practices, while also attracting top-skilled professionals and highly motivated personnel to work on this flagship project of Afrexim Bank. And in this center, the bank will be able to provide research and development capabilities in order to ensure that the African Medical Center of Excellence provides state-of-the-art services and a service offering that really competes with leading medical facilities in the world. Thank you.
Thank you, Adam. And thank you so much to all the participants. I do apologize that we couldn't take everybody's questions, but I'm already very aware of the fact that I have even broken my own promise of only keeping you for an extra 15 minutes. But we are at the end of the session now. And Obi, do you want to say a final word of to have a final word to close the session? Thank you.
Just to appreciate all the people from the Wits School of Governance, NXN Analytics, and my own people here, led by Charles, for all the good work that's been put in. It's been a tough few weeks, and putting this together hasn't been easy, but I'm really glad that the outcome today has proven that the good work has borne fruit. The discussion is just beginning, and before the session signs off, Nomfundo, can you put an email where people who are interested in furthering this engagement can either drop their ideas or drop their questions, so that when we get onto developing the platform, which the Honorable Minister had mentioned during his ministerial address, we will be able to engage with the technical expertise, the frankly immense technical expertise that I can see on the platform. I think with that, Nomfundo, just to say thank you and good night to everybody.
Thank you and good night.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Thank you. Bye.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.